This is the United States History 202, Presentation 13, World War I and the United States. So, World War I lasted from 1914 to 1919, but the United States is only going to be involved in the war for the last couple of years. So, I'm going to give you a brief background on how the war began. If you want more detail, you can take my Western Civ 2 class, but we'll get into a little bit of detail how the war began, but then we'll mostly talk about United States involvement militarily, and also how this involvement is going to affect the United States domestically as well, because there's some major changes taking place with the entrance of the United States into World War I. So, as I said before, World War I lasted from 1914 to 1919. It was a terribly destructive war. In fact, the only war that will surpass it in terms of destruction is World War II. But this was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars when it was going on. Nobody called it World War I until there was a World War II. But 10 million men were killed, 30 million men were wounded, and so a very destructive war in terms of property damage as well. I don't have any numbers here, but extremely destructive in terms of how many cities were leveled and property destruction. But just the loss of life is incomprehensible, and it'll only get worse in World War II. The United States was only briefly involved in the conflict. And essentially, we're going to go on the side of what's called the Triple Entente, Great Britain, France, and Russia. And the other side would be what's known as the Triple Alliance, Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. The United States would suffer only 2% of all Entente military deaths, or 116,000 men. So that, just think about that. 116,000 men, that's only 2% of all the military deaths for our side. And put that in perspective, in the current conflict which the United States is involved in, which has been going on now for about 11 years, the occupation of Iraq, and then, of course, later Afghanistan first, then Iraq, and now just Afghanistan again. The United States, in terms of deaths, has lost, it's under 10,000 men. So in 2 years, the U.S. loses 116,000 men. So, that just puts all this in perspective and how bloody this conflict was. So here you can see 2% for the United States and the pie chart. Now, long-term causes of the war. Well, militarism was one. Germany, France, and Great Britain engaged in an arms race during the early 20th century, mostly through the buildup of naval forces. So as they build these navies, you got to use them. You build the toys, you have to use them. You're eventually going to have to shoot at each other. Alliances. European powers developed a complex series of alliances, many of which were secret. So you could declare war on one country, and by default you were declaring war on 2 or 3 countries. You didn't even know it. And there were secret pacts, and some countries had pacts with other countries, competing powers at the same time. So this is very complex and very dangerous. All European powers had vested interest in African and Asian colonies, and the colonial race produced heated rivalries. So, as countries are, even though there was something called the Scramble for Africa, where they all kind of got into a room and said, okay, you're going to take this, you're going to take this, you're going to take this, these colonies still created rivalries. Nationalism was part of this. Many Europeans developed extreme nationalism in this period. And of course, nationalism by definition is pride in your racial, ethnic, or national identity, and it can produce hostility towards other peoples. So nationalism can be very dangerous. And of course, social Darwinism. This fanned the flames of nationalism. The white man's burden, the desire to prove that your nation was the best. All these things are going to lead to animosity. Brits thought of themselves as better than Germans, and Germans better than French. And so all these things are working towards producing some hostility in Europe during this time. The funny thing about all that, though, is that all these people were related in terms of the ruling elite. The Russian Tsar was related to the English king, who was related to the German Kaiser, so they're all related. So this is just a big mess. It's a big family squabble that results in a war. And here you can see the alliance structures. You can see Russia, France, and Britain on one side, and Italy, Austria, Hungary, and Germany on the other side, with Bulgaria and Serbia in the middle. And that's essentially what's going to happen. And a lot of these treaties were secret. Nobody knew about them. So World War I was the first great modern naval conflict, and the German naval secretary at the time was a man named Alfred von Tirpitz. And he wanted this competition between Britain and Germany because he thought that would be good for Germany. And if they built up their naval forces, that would produce strength. And remember, Bismarck, well, I hadn't talked about this in this class, but the German unification movement in the 19th century Germany was put together, unified through blood and iron. That's what Bismarck said. Otto von Bismarck in the process of putting Germany together, and this is the iron, having a very strong military. In 1906, the first powerful battleship in modern naval history was produced. It was called the Dreadnought-class battleship in Great Britain, and on the eve of World War I, Germany had 18 of these, and Great Britain had 29. So as long as Germany was within striking distance, they were fine with that. But these battleships had 12-inch guns, which is the diameter of the barrel of the weapon, and so they're very powerful, heavily armored ships, very fast ships. So of course battleships had long been the jewel of the Navy. Now of course they're obsolete, but the idea was to get in linear formations and bombard each other, and if you sank more of theirs, you won. Now, the Germans were also involved in heavy military planning, and one of the most famous German military planners was a man named Alfred von Schlieffen. And so the Schlieffen Plan called for speed, mobility, and surprise, and essentially Germany was going to attack through Belgium into France should war be declared. So they would attack France first, then Russia. And of course, France knew this. They were preparing for it. They were building up their defenses. And everyone was planning at this time. This is essentially what war colleges do. So the professionalization of the military is going to lead to this type of war planning. Now, the immediate factors leading to World War I. Well, in 1914, the Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria, Archduke Franz Ferdinand was the Austrian Emperor Franz Joseph's nephew. So he was assassinated in Serbia, and so then Austria will invade Serbia and mobilized for war. At that point, if you look back at the slide I had on the alliance structure, at that point, Germany and France would declare war on Austria because Serbia was aligned with France, and then so Germany has to declare war on France, and because Germany declares war on France, Russia then will mobilize for war against Germany. Germany will refuse to back down at this point. The Russians actually open the door. Everybody's mobilizing. I should say declare war. They're all mobilizing. They're all getting their troops ready, moving to the front lines, getting their military supplies ready. Russia opened the door to negotiation and said, look, we don't need to have a war here. But Germany was very bellicose. They were belligerent, and they wanted war. And so they were not willing to back down. And so by August 3rd, 1914, all of Europe was at war because of this little incident in Serbia. And then, of course, because of all the other long-term factors leading into this. So here's the Western Front. That was for the United States, it's the most important focus for us. There was also the Eastern Front, which was the front between Germany and Russia. But the Western Front is the picture there. It goes through Belgium, of course, into France. You can see the Germans actually pushed almost into Paris by September of 1914, but eventually were then pushed back. And then this became a stagnant front, which had a lot of problems for soldiers on the ground. Military improvements made this war extremely bloody. You had breech-loading rifles with magazine clips, so now you could have more firepower for your infantrymen. You had the machine gun, more accurate sniper weapons, which of course is going to increase the loss of life. Concrete and steel defensive positions, trenches and barbed wire were going to be put up along the Western Front, which is going to create obstacles and, of course, better fortifications so men aren't killed. And then when they try to charge these positions, they're picked to pieces. Long-range artillery. So you would have artillery bombardments that could last for 12 to 20 hours at a time, which was, they called people getting shell-shocked. They actually shook continually because they were so shocked by the amount of, scared by the amount of arsenal being thrown in, apparatus, gunpowder being thrown in on them at any one time. Tanks were used in this particular war. Not very effective, but they did enter the battlefield. There was one large mechanized battle in World War I, but all the tanks broke down after that point. So essentially these were for infantry support. Aircraft were used, mostly for reconnaissance, but some dogfighting. In fact, the most famous being the Red Baron, the German ace pilot, who was shot down actually not by another plane, but by an infantryman, an Australian, in a trench, shot him down with his rifle. Poison gas, chlorine and mustard gas were used during this war. This is very nasty stuff, so we actually had chemical warfare in World War I as well. Now, the Western Front was 400 miles of trenches. It was said that you could smell the Western Front before you got there because there was nothing living there except for the men and the lice and the rats. These things were full of sewage, dead bodies. The disease rate was very high. This was a horrible place to be. It smelled like blood, death. It's terrible. In between each trench, you had no man's land. So that meant that there was an area of barbed wire where if you tried to cross, it was usually muddy. I mean, it was horrible. You'd get up, you'd call what's going over the top, you'd pop up out of the trench, try to run to the other trench, and in the process you're getting shot with machine guns and sniper rifles and small arms fire and everything else. The bleed dry strategy was simply a war of attrition. We're just going to wear each other down. This is what the French and the Germans decided they were going to do. Wear each other down. Eventually one side would give up. So the heavy machine gun fire when you went up over the top, but before that you would try to soften up the other side with artillery fire, and then you would have a prolonged, maybe a day-long deluge of artillery fire, and then you would try to take the other trench, which usually didn't work. In the summer of 1914, 1 million men would die in the first 3 months of the war. The Battle of Verdun in 1916 resulted in 900,000 deaths, due mostly to artillery. The Battle of the Somme in 1916 resulted in 1.1 million deaths. This is a very destructive and bloody war, extremely nasty, and of course the United States wanted to stay out of it. The American people wanted to stay out of it for most of the war, but they're going to be pushed into it by the political class and the bankers. So Woodrow Wilson actually declared U.S. neutrality in 1914. Of course, it's not the president's policy to openly declare U.S. neutrality. That should be the Congress to do. But Wilson, of course, as a progressive, looks at this as a strong executive branch. It's his job to do so. Now, the war would eventually affect Americans, but gradually. Wilson, in fact, was privately pushing for American involvement in the conflict. His Secretary of State, William Jennings Bryan, the guy that ran for president 3 times and failed, now he's Secretary of State, would later resign because of Wilson's push for war. So privately, Wilson is pushing for war, but publicly he's saying, oh, we're going to stay out of this war. It works to his advantage politically. Now, U.S. bankers actually began to fund the war for the Triple Entente. So they're lending money to Germany. They're lending money to Great Britain. They're lending money to France, not Germany. Great Britain and France. And so we're becoming close buddies with the British and the French. Most of the U.S. public would also side with the British and the French if they were not neutral on the issue. And the Germans will eventually begin unlimited submarine warfare in the North Atlantic. And the idea there was to sink any commercial ships that were carrying weapons. Now, this caused problems for the United States. Why? Because the British began using human shields. What they would do is put weapons in passenger ships, like the Lusitania, pictured at left. It was a cousin ship of the Titanic, which actually sank 3 years before this. And so it was hazardous to sail on the White Star Line. In fact, interestingly enough, the Titanic's sister ship was actually a hospital ship in World War I, and it sank in the Mediterranean. And so they figured out recently how the Titanic sank because of that ship and how it sank and some of the improvements that were made on it. So that's actually a whole other interesting story. But the Lusitania was carrying weapons of war. It was a passenger ship, and the Germans sank it. There were Americans on board. And so the American public is outraged because Americans were killed on this passenger ship. The Germans had warned passengers, do not sail on these ships because we know the British are putting weapons on there and we're going to sink them. And that was the case with the Lusitania. Wilson would briefly negotiate a suspension in U-boat attacks, in part to help his re-election bid. Why? Because he was up for re-election in 1916. The war had been going on now for 2 years. And he was opposed by a man named Charles Evans Hughes, who was a Supreme Court justice. He urged more involvement for the United States in World War I, but Wilson had a campaign pledge. He kept us out of war. So his pledge was that we're not going to get involved in this war. So he had to publicly push that position, even though privately, again, he wants the United States involved. But the American public doesn't, as you can see by the results. So Wilson doesn't get 50% of the vote. He didn't in 1912 either. But he does get more in the popular vote, and he wins a very close victory in the Electoral College. But that just shows you that the American public was fairly certain they didn't want to be involved. The majority didn't want to be involved in World War I. As soon as the election is over, though, Wilson is going to get us involved within a year. So Germany would reopen submarine attacks against Allied shipping in 1916, including the U.S., and it's also in 1916 that a man named Alfred Zimmerman, who was the German secretary to Mexico, authors something called the Zimmerman Note. In it, he says, well, if Mexico, you will declare war on the United States, then we'll help you out, and if we win, you can get all the territory back that was taken from you in 1848. So this thing is intercepted, published in the American press, and now the United States is really hostile towards Germany. And Wilson thinks he's got enough ammunition to ask for war, so on April 2nd, 1917, Wilson will ask Congress for a declaration of war. He says in his message, this war is going to make the world safe for democracy. So here, again, back to Presentation 11, when I talked about United States imperialism, and in the presentation where I got into Philip Drew Administrator with Edward M. House, Colonel House, in the last presentation, presentation 12. I mentioned that one of the things that the new nationalism, or new freedom, I should say new freedom, called for was a war between the major powers, and this would allow the president to become a virtual dictator. We're going to see that in the American economy. And to make the world safe for democracy, I mean, this is when liberty, democracy become these driving factors in American expansion and imperialism and foreign policy. So 116,000 American soldiers are going to die to make the world safe for democracy, whatever that means. Nobody could really figure this out. Well, on April 6th, Congress will declare war on Germany, and so now the United States is involved in World War I. Here's a nice little map of World War I. What's interesting about that, you can see that this is 1917, and the Russians will be out of the war within a year because you have the Russian Revolution, and then the communists will take over, and they want Russia out of the war. So eventually Germany is fighting a one-front war with the United States, really exclusively the United States, in this period of time. Now, in 1917, John J. Blackjack Pershing was sent over to France and the Western Front, essentially, to determine what kind of involvement the United States needed. When he comes back, he has a very grim picture. He says Britain and France are running out of men, money, and material. They need it quickly. The United States needs to get involved quickly. Initial estimates are that the United States needed about 500,000 men to fight this war. He said that's too little, way too little. In fact, he called for 3.5 million men, and that's what the United States is going to get, 3.5 million men, and they're going to do it through several means. They are going to get about 500,000 men volunteer for the war, but they're also going to institute a draft. So the Selective Service Act of 1917. Where 3 million men will be drafted by 1919. This is still in effect today. Selective service. This is what you sign up for when you're a man 18. You go register for the draft. It was reinstated, of course, during World War II, and then also during the Vietnam War, and then cut out for several years. But then Jimmy Carter reinstated it back in the 1970s. So the American government, or United States government, also revs up its propaganda machine to glorify the struggle. There's a song written over there, which I've linked to, and there's many posters put out there. Call of Duty, join the Army for home and country. Gee, I wish I were a man, I'd join the Navy. Be a man and do it. So all these things are out there in full force to get people to sign up. The other thing, of course, you're going to have to do in World War I is finance the war. So wars are expensive. So the United States will dust off its new income tax, its shiny new income tax, raise income tax rates up to the 75 to 80%. And try to get people's money that way. And then they're also going to start borrowing tremendous money. And, of course, this is made possible by the Federal Reserve System. So we have this shiny new central banking system that allows for all this stuff to happen, too. It's no coincidence that with the Federal Reserve System, wars were much more frequent in the 20th century because we have a central bank that allows for the United States to borrow tremendous amounts of money and, of course, to inflate the money supply and also expand credit. So, this is all the only way we could fight World War I was through much more centralization of the economy. Now, in terms of other government activity, the government would encourage union and the unionization of workers. What does that have to do with World War I? Well, nothing. But see, this was an opportunity for the government to go out there and use this to push a progressive agenda. They start fixing prices. They start directing consumption, production, and transportation through various government agencies like the War Industries Board, the Food Administration, the Railway Board, the U.S. Shipping Board, the War Trade Board. All these things were put into effect to regulate the economy unconstitutionally, which, I mean, there's nothing in the Constitution that allows the government to do this. In fact, the government nationalized the railroads in 1917. Again, nothing in the Constitution that allows you to do this, but if you read Philip Drew Administrator and Edward Mandell House, this is what he said should happen. War opponents were deported. In fact, there's two pieces of legislation, the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918, which were designed to cut dissent. So if you were speaking out against the war, you could be kicked out of the country, thrown in prison. This is purely unconstitutional. Sedition law, violates the First Amendment to the Constitution. Eugene Debs, in fact, the guy that ran for president in 1912, is going to be arrested and serve 3 years in prison for his opposition to the war. He's pardoned by Warren G. Harding. But, I mean, this is how crazy this stuff is getting. People are being thrown in prison, deported, all kinds of stuff is going on. And it's all because we got involved in this very big European conflict. I mentioned the government propaganda arm. So you have something called the Committee of Public Information. It gave the official news for the press, the correct interpretation of the war for history. It closely guarded military information. German Americans during this time period were required to kiss the U.S. flag, cite the Pledge of Allegiance, and buy substantial numbers of war bonds. If they didn't, they could be in real trouble. Physical violence. In fact, people were killed for this. And the idea was to promote Wilson's war aims abroad. So we actually have a propaganda arm of the government actually rev up during this time to make people support the war. Well, U.S. participation in the Western Front will begin in 1918, and it is the United States militarily that's going to swing the tide of the war in favor of our allies, the Triple Entente. So our Navy is going to use its light warships, its mines, and its depth charges against German submarines. This cut losses to U.S. and British shipping in half. The Army is part of the major Allied offensive that began in August 1918 and ended in November 1918. So about 2 months, the United States is really going to make a push, and this is when most of our casualties, 116,000 men, are killed. The U.S. did not produce much in the material until the end of the war. No tanks and very little artillery. This is a World War I tank and what they look like. But they did produce the best airplane engines in the war, and many of the British planes were refitted to allow the Entente powers to control the skies. Now, as I mentioned before, there were some major problems in this war. These are pictures. The picture on the left is trench foot, so your feet actually rot off because they're sitting in so much water all the time. Of course, frostbite can contribute to that as well. The guy on the right is a victim of a mustard gas attack, so you can see the boils on his skin. It's very horrible, very horrible thing to get. You had to wear your gas mask, so there's the guys in the machine gun position wearing those. If you don't, you're going to have like the guy on the left there. This is a combat image. The guy on the left, a French soldier getting shot running across no man's land, and then, of course, the guy on the right stuck in the barbed wire. There's a trench, or no man's land in a trench, pretty nasty conditions. And here is a picture of a field in France that's just pockmarked by the countless artillery barrages and some damage to a city. Here's a German photograph, some guys in a trench shooting some French soldiers. All right, well, to make a long story short, the United States does its job and actually wins the war by our push. And so near the end of the war, you're going to have something called the Paris Peace Conference. There was an armistice on 11/11/11, 1918, and essentially November 11th, 1918, the 11th day of the 11th month of the 11th hour. This is Armistice Day. Today we call that Veterans Day. But the big four represented at the Paris Peace Conference would be the U.S., Great Britain, France, and Italy. Germany and Austria were left out of the negotiations. Russia did not participate, and Europe feared the impact of communism in Russia. So this was a dictated peace, as I'll talk about in a second. But President Woodrow Wilson had his 14 points for a lasting peace. He wanted freedom of the seas, public rather than secret diplomacy, removal of trade barriers, reduction of armaments, and adjustment of colonial claims. Most important for Wilson, though, was something called a League of Nations, which the United States will not join. So in this particular case, interest would win out over idealism. Wilson wanted these things but didn't get a lot of it. Germany and Austria, in fact, would be fearfully punished by the other powers. The League of Nations would be formed, and Britain and France would dominate this organization, but the United States refused to participate, so it was very ineffective and weak. Essentially, all this culminated in something called the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. This was a dictated peace. Germany had to accept full guilt for the conflict. The Kaiser had to go into exile. They had to pay heavy war reparations. They had to disarm and turn over all colonies as well as territory in Europe. In fact, they lost about 10% of the European territory. Austria-Hungary would be broken up. The Ottoman Empire would be dissolved. You would get the creation of two countries, Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. So actually, Woodrow Wilson was involved in nation building. And in fact, both of these nations have since broken up. So again, this was a messy situation. The United States created all kinds of problems here in Europe, and this will lead to World War II. So there's what Europe looked like after the Treaty of Versailles of 1919. You can see Yugoslavia and Czechoslovakia as countries, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire is broken up. The Ottoman Empire is broken up. Now you have Turkey, an independent country. Now, the results: Germany would be emasculated and wrecked. Austria cannot side with Germany, and the Habsburgs were out of power. The United States would become a world power, but not yet the world power. So basically what you're going to have is an unstable Europe and the rise of totalitarian regimes, including Soviet Russia. This is really just a pause between wars. World War II was brought about because of World War I. Now, I mentioned in Presentation 11 I was going to talk about an anti-imperialist treaty. Well, I got that here in this particular presentation. So, the United States does not ratify the Treaty of Versailles. They ended the war through a joint resolution of Congress. And people like Henry Cabot Lodge of Massachusetts were very much against the Treaty of Versailles, one of the reasons being the League of Nations. In fact, Wilson would suffer a series of strokes while stumping for the treaty and eventually would be incapacitated, essentially, during the end of his second term in office. So, is there an anti-war tradition in the United States? Well, we saw that the United States was dragging its feet to get involved in this war, and it was not popular in all areas of the United States. Some opposed it for political reasons, others because they were pacifists. Many socialists opposed the war. Some were deported or arrested, perhaps as many as 170,000 people. So the United States not only has an anti-war tradition, but an anti-imperialist tradition as well. The Anti-Imperialist League, in fact, was around during this time. It was around from 1898 to 1921. It opposed the Spanish-American War. They split on World War I. And prominent members of the Anti-Imperialist League included people like Grover Cleveland, Mark Twain, Jane Addams, Ambrose Bierce, Andrew Carnegie, Samuel Gompers, and Moorfield Story. William Howard Taft, former President Taft, generally opposed World War I, though his son would join the Army. He was not a member of the Anti-Imperialist League. All right, so in summary, the United States entered the war late. The U.S. military did help turn the tide of war by providing fresh troops and supplies. The war increased the power of the central government in the United States, as we've seen, and the peace treaty that Wilson authored helped lead to World War II just 20 years later. And the war was not popular. There was a common misconception this war was very popular. It wasn't. Most American wars have been, in fact, very unpopular. The only one you could say that wasn't was World War II. And even then, there were people trying to keep the United States out of that war, as we'll talk about when we get to that presentation. All right, so the next time I'll see you for Presentation 14, the 1920s. See you then.